All right. Helping Parents Heal is a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting, hold on one second. I have a technical issue here. What's going on? I'm having a technical problem. There we go. I think I figured it out. Sorry about that. Let's start over again. Helping Parents Heal is a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting bereaved parents to become shining light parents by providing support and resources to aid in the healing process. We go a step beyond other groups by allowing the open discussion of spiritual experiences, evidence for the afterlife in a non-dogmatic way. Affiliate groups welcome everyone, regardless of religious or non-religious background, and we allow for open dialogue. Attendance today at the Helping Parents Heal meeting is voluntary, and we are here for the benefit of learning from and sharing with other parents whose children have passed away. It is understood that our discussions are intended to be confidential, are not designed to replace traditional therapy or spiritual counseling. Helping Parents Heal offers a wide variety of speakers to allow parents to be informed about many possible ways to heal, to connect with their children, and to learn about the afterlife. The views expressed by our guests do not necessarily reflect those of Helping Parents Heal, and we ask that you take from their presentations whatever may benefit you personally.
Thank you so much, Brian. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Raymond Moody. I've had the pleasure of meeting him at 2 different conferences. He's one of the nicest people that you'd ever meet. And he's also one of the most intelligent. Dr. Raymond Moody Jr., MD and PhD, is the best-selling author of many books, which have sold more than 20 million copies worldwide. His seminal work, Life After Life, that was published in 1975, completely changed the way we view death and dying, and made Dr. Moody the leading authority on the near-death experience. He later followed this work with Glimpses of Eternity that was published in 2010 about shared death experiences, among other works that he also published. Dr. Moody received his medical degree from the College of Georgia and his PhD from the University of Virginia, where he also received an MA and a BA. He is a frequent media guest and has been featured in hundreds of publications. He was also to be a keynote presenter at our second Helping Parents Heal conference in Charleston, South Carolina. He lives in Anniston, Alabama, and he's also a shining light dad. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Raymond Moody. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for asking me to be with you tonight. I just greatly appreciate this. And as I was saying earlier, before we actually officially started, I am sad to say that I too lost my first child at the age of 36 hours. In 1970, which was a time before men were supposed to cry and before people talked about grief. And I've got stories to tell, as I'm sure you all, and so I know how, from this side of it, I know that too. So what I was hearing from Elizabeth is that all of you have had some adventures with the question of life after death. And that's what I thought I would talk with you about tonight, because paradoxically, because in a way I was the last person you would think who would be interested in the question of life after death. Because when I was a very young person, my family was just not church growers. I remember, I surmised subsequently that my dad, who was a medic in World War II and in the Pacific Theater, I just sort of imagined retrospectively that his sarcasm about religion was related to that horrors that he no doubt saw. And but anyway, the way it came out is that he was just totally intolerant of religion. And that was all right with me. I was interested in astronomy. Meanwhile, my grandmother, my mother's mother, religion was her favorite topic of gentle humor. She just thought religion was so funny. And so I got those were the attitudes I had. And so um, at the age of 18, I decided to go to the University of Virginia to study astronomy, but was interested in philosophy too, so I decided to take a philosophy course my first semester. And literally, like the first couple of days, I decided I'm going to be a philosophy major. And Plato, reading Plato's Republic was what hooked me. And Plato is still, after all these years, he's still my hero. And I was so impressed by that book and his other writings. And at the end of the dialogue, the Republic, there's this story about a warrior who was believed dead on the battlefield, but revived. And he told a story of going into another world. And so I remember being intrigued by that because I honestly, at that point, I had no idea that there was anybody who took the question of an afterlife seriously. My only exposure to it was in cartoons where they show the angels and all, and that was the degree of my ignorance of this. And this is a very odd thing to say, I guess, for a logician, but nonetheless, the fact that Plato took the question seriously was what I thought, well, if Plato takes this question seriously, then there's got to be something to it. That was a ridiculous argument in a way, but that's the way I thought. And so I asked my professor about this story, and he said, yeah, that these early Greek philosophers studied cases of people who were believed dead but revived. And he went on to say that another philosopher who was a little before Plato, who had studied these things, was Democritus, who was the first person to figure out that, contrary to the fact that this here looks solid, that if you think about it, it's made up of tiny little bits that are too small to see. He just figured that out. And from that point of view, he said, oh, these stories about, dying and coming back, he said, that's just the residual biological activity in the body. He said, there's no such thing as a moment of death. So you see right there with Plato and Democritus 2,300 years ago, we have the same debate we're hearing today, right? Between the people who look at this and think of it as an indicator of an afterlife, then on the other hand, who look at this and they say oxygen deprivation to the brain. Well, I have never taken the oxygen deprivation to the brain seriously for two reasons. Primary one was that before I went to medical school, I got a PhD in philosophy. I was a philosophy professor for 3 years. And I'll tell you the truth, it's true when I was in graduate school in philosophy, and it's still true today, that anybody who thinks that they understand how the mind and the brain are related is, just and a little self-esteem festival there that has no relation to the body. This is just really a very, very indecipherable question in a way, and why not admit that? That's the joy of philosophy, is thinking about these things. So, and then the contrary theory is epiphenomenalism, which is a lot of neuroscientists get into this, the thinking that there is no independent reality to consciousness, that it's just that consciousness is the secondary effect of the brain process, which is the only reality to them, right? Well, that has holes in it philosophically, but Also, when I was in my first year of medical school, one of my own psychiatry professors or medical professors told me about how she, when she was trying to resuscitate her own mother unsuccessfully, that she herself, the physician, rose up and she saw her mother's now deceased body down below, saw her own body. She said, I sensed my mother's presence there with me, and she saw her mother. She um, saw um, apparitions of relatives and friends of her mother's who had died emerging from this light and kind of joining with the spirit of her mother. And what I'm getting at here is obviously my professor, who was not ill or injured, she was resuscitating her mother, but she nonetheless had all of these qualities that were episodes that we think of as near-death experiences, right? So, and this is very common in other contexts. It's very common for people who are not ill or injured, and therefore who are not having oxygen deprivation to the brain, nonetheless have these experiences. They're the death of someone else, of seeming to leave their bodies or seeing light. Or I have numerous cases of people who, in the proximity of somebody else who was dying, empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person who was passing away. And for some years, I assumed that surely it had to be somebody close to the person who was dying. But no, then some years ago, we got a communication from a doctor who was called to the ER to resuscitate a patient he had never laid eyes on. And yet in resuscitating this patient, said he was surrounded by these sort of holographic images of this man's life. And so, you know, something much weirder than oxygen deprivation to the brain is going on. And, you know, one of the easiest things for me to say is, I don't know, you know, but some people have a hard time saying, I don't know. So now, so you've all studied about near-death experiences, and
Dr. Moody, I think that maybe we've lost you just a little bit. Maybe the internet connection has gone down. Can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Paul. And Irene and Brian, you hear me as well, right? My
Yes,
internet connection is sometimes not great.
Yeah, maybe you want to call him.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and try calling him. Just one second.
all right, hello.
There he is. Okay.
Okay, good.
Sorry about that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, great.
Record, share screen. Okay, so we're good? We're good?
Sorry, it just got frozen a second there, but we're good now. Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Dr. Moody.
Great. So, the first living person I ever heard from this from was one of the greatest guys I ever knew. The finest man I ever knew. His name was George Ritchie. And he was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia when I was there as an undergraduate philosophy student. And everybody in philosophy knew about Dr. Ritchie's experience. He had been pronounced dead, and he was willing to talk about this. So I heard Dr. Ritchie talk about this in 1965. And I knew that George was real. That much was obvious. What I didn't know was whether the experience was real, or even, you know, what to make of that. And not that I never had this idea of oxygen deprivation. That's pointless, really. But I just didn't know what it was. And so the process I've been through came to a head for me, I suppose, about 5 or 6 years ago with the case of Jeffrey Olson and Dr. Jeffrey O'Driscoll, that I think that you folks have heard about, and also other friends of mine who are medical doctors who've had experiences of empathically co-living their patients' near-death experiences. My point is, I give up. You know, the legitimate way to go is you've got to try to figure your way out of things rather than into them. Because if you try to figure out how you want things to be and try to make, that's never stable. You're always miserable inside. What I want to do is try to figure out what really is the case, because it's so interesting. Reality is so much more interesting than anything anybody can make up. So I just finally got to the point where I can't think of any option to say except that, to my astonished surprise, there is, I gather, life after death. Right now, I am sure that most people listening to this also have that recurrent experience. You go to the workshop, or you go to the medium, or you hear the dynamic speaker about the near-death experiences, and it's a lift for a while you're there, but the doubts resurface, right? Well, I'm going to step out on a limb tonight, because I've really been kind of thinking about this for weeks and weeks. I was going to do this on April 17th in Charleston, but I've sort of postponed it to now. And that is that, in all seriousness, I, Raymond Moody, hereby want to claim that I have made a genuine breakthrough in the rigorously rational investigation of life after death. And I want to claim not only that, but that anybody who goes through this argument and thinks this through will have to acknowledge that I am right, unless I've been existing in some sort of delusional world for this is really my career. In Life After Life, I talk about my interest in philosophy, and specifically I said logic and philosophy of language. That's what I'm interested in, as from the philosophical point of view. And that is really where the action is, no matter what anybody wants to say. Where the real action is on life after death is in terms of the linguistic aspect of it. And you say, oh, that sounds so trivial and all, but no, listen, because when people come back from their near-death experience, the only vehicle they have at their command to convey it to the rest of us is through their language, right? And what they universally say is that no matter how articulate they may be, they say, I can't describe it to you. It is just astonishing. Now, I, Raymond Moody, hereby claim that I have solved that problem. And I want to say that not to pat myself on the back or to propound a new belief system, but really to challenge you guys. And I mean in the sense that look at what I've done and see if you can refute it. Because see, that's what people who are trained in the philosophy background, that's what we love. We try to put our ideas out there and to argue for them as clearly as we can and then throw it out, paradoxically hoping that someone will find a flaw in your work, because then if they find a flaw, then that brings you closer to the truth, right? Because you see your mistake. Or if they can't find any flaw in it, that gives you more confidence that you're on the right track. So it's a win-win proposition for somebody like me who is claiming that I've got a breakthrough in rational investigation of life after death. And I am hereby claiming it. And let me explain. When you look at this from the point of view of a person who is genuinely interested in rational reflection on it, and not from any sort of wish fulfilling thing. You know, some of them say, oh, the idea of life after death, it's all wish fulfillment. Well, that's ridiculous, because my best friend of 30 years was a guy named Milton Friedman, not the economist. My Milton was a presidential speechwriter, just this really terrific guy. And Milton was just sort of, he and I used to talk about the afterlife, right? But he was rooting against it. And there is a long tradition of people who have not wanted there to be an afterlife. And for their various reasons. So wish fulfillment doesn't have anything to do with it. And I never really faced the question of whether I wanted there to be an afterlife until a few years ago, where I was forced into the insight, I guess, that there is. So I think those are two different questions. And if you look at it just from the point of view of the rational person, the agreement is vast among people who've looked at it from that point of view, is that the person who most clearly formulated the difficulty was named David Hume. And David Hume was one of my favorite philosophers. He lived from 1711 to 1776. And his famous
Looks like Dr. Moody is possibly frozen again, and I am really sorry to see that. But I'm going to go ahead and try calling Sam again and see if possibly we can get him back on as quickly as possible before he says something way too important.
Well, hopefully he'll be right back. It's worth the inconvenience and the trouble just to get to hear him speak. Right, Brian?
Yeah, he's got an unstable internet, so hopefully we'll get him
Yeah.
back and get through this. But yeah, he is a brilliant man.
Yeah, it's really something that he's speaking to all of us. It's such an honor.
It
Yeah,
is.
I feel like we're all like sitting on the edge of our chairs,
Yeah.
taking
What
it
is-
all in.
What is he going to say next?
Yeah.
I talked to Dr. George Ritchie, and
So can I just let you guys know very quickly, he's on his way back on. He can hear us, he just can't.
Yeah, can y'all hear
You know,
us?
it might be best to turn off his video since his internet's unstable. And
Oh, okay. Would that help?
it can help.
Yeah, okay. So we're gonna, but can y'all hear us?
Oh,
Yeah,
but
we can hear you.
You're fine now, though, actually.
So we're gonna I tell you what, let's give it one more chance and then
Yeah,
let's
do that.
Let's do that.
Yeah,
Sounds
if we
good.
freeze up, we'll stop the video.
All right, thanks. We appreciate your help.
Thank you.
good. So Hume said, and think this through, he said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. He said, some new species of logic is required for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. And what he's saying there in simple terms is, we simply can't solve the afterlife question with the mind we have and the logic we have. I won't go into a logic professor bit about why that is. It has to do with the fact that Aristotelian logic is predicated on literal meaning, but you're not dealing with literal meaning when you're dealing with questions about life after death. That's basically the problem. But anyway, since about 1969, I've been teaching my philosophy students an entirely new way to think, where you can think logically about things that don't make sense. And the classical objection to the question of life after death of Hume and others is that it's unintelligible. Like it brings images to our minds, but if you think it through, what are we talking about? Life after death? Isn't that self-contradiction? It's like Woody Allen said one time, if you can survive death, you can survive just about anything, right? And so, can you hear me?
Oh no.
Yes, we can, definitely.
Okay, good. So that's the real question. Now, since 1969, this is partly my doctoral dissertation, but I've continued to work on it. And I have figured out how to think logically about things that don't make sense, unintelligible things. And nonsense, not in a bad sense, but in the sense of Dr. Seuss and Lewis Carroll and so on, right? Which is a whole department of language. And so I knew full well that this eventually became a full semester-length university course, which I've taught many times. And I knew full well that eventually somebody who had taken this course would have a near-death experience. Hello?
We're still here.
We're still here.
We're still here. Sorry, there was a microphone that got unmuted. Sorry about that.
So, basically, and I knew that when that happened, that a person who had their near-death experience already having this new way of thinking in their mind would be able to conceptualize the near-death experience in a whole new way and to talk about it for the rest of us in a whole new way. Now, it has happened. In 2015, a very wonderful man who's a distinguished artist and scientist who had my course some years before had a near-death experience. And it's a very complicated story, but he did. And he basically confirmed what I'm telling you, that in effect, it is perfectly possible for us to reformat our mind in such a way that when subsequently we happen to have a near-death experience, we will be able to come back and to explain it to others in a way that nobody ever has before. But that is not the main object. The main object that I've taught this course on for years is that three things. Number one, it improves analytical and creative thinking. And number two, it actually improves creativity. Beginning in the 60s, actually, my students always told about how after this course, the artist students would, for example, say, just brought streams of creativity and so on. And also because it throws a light on a lot of important questions of philosophy and science. And this course came complete with exercises that were designed to open parts of the students' minds that they didn't even know they had. And that corresponds very nicely to Hume's comment about faculties of the mind and some new faculties of the mind that may enable us to comprehend that logic. So what I'm getting at here is I want to challenge you guys. This has recently been published, by the way, and I'm not trying to sell a book here, honest. But this book is entitled Making Sense of Nonsense by Raymond Moody. It's published just by Llewellyn. And in that book, I talk about how to think about things that don't make sense. And over the years, people from all kinds of professions have taken my course and, said attorneys, for example, helps their critical thinking skills. Literature professors came to my class because they thought it added insight to literature. And artists and also advertisers. That's a very interesting one. A number of people over the years who are in advertising have come to my seminars because they think, but basically this book has all the exercises and also, I think it costs $17 or something. I'm honest to goodness, I'm not trying to make money here, but rather to sort of issue a challenge and look at this and work through the exercises and see if you don't agree with me that apparently this is a totally new way of investigating near-death experiences. And also in there is the ancient Greeks had a technique at their ancient oracles of the dead, which is something I got interested in because of their relevance to the origins of Greek philosophy. Actually had a lot to do with these places called oracles of the dead, where they apparently you would go to these places and they had techniques where you would actually seem to see and converse with the spirits of departed loved ones. And so, to make a long story short, I had gotten interested in this by reading it in Aristophanes and Herodotus back in 1962. But in 1985, I found out that the most famous of the oracles of the dead had been excavated. And based on what they found there, I was able to surmise how it worked. And I set it up and it works. Basically, it's something that is kind of a part of the collective cultural heritage of humankind, really. And it's involved going through sort of inner processes, and it's all laid out in the book. And so if anybody listening to this would be willing to take up my challenge and to just tell me what you think of it, and if you can find a flaw in it, I'd be happy, because that will help me correct my mistake. But I think that we have here now a whole new way of looking at near-death experiences and the question of life after death. And I wanted to leave plenty of time tonight for your questions and comments.
This is amazing. And I was just typing in the chat box that what we need to do is all read your book and then have a book club and have you come back and you can answer questions. And
I would love to. Because, I'm known for the near-death experience, but my heart has been, since I was a kid, I have just loved nonsense. And it's like, I remember Dr. Seuss was one of my favorites, and of course, Lewis Carroll and Through the Looking Glass. But my favorite was a guy that, unless some of you are much older like I am, I'm 75, unless some of you are in that age range, you're not likely to know about Carl Barks, who was a Disney artist who created the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge characters for the comic books, which were so popular with my generation. And in his works, I got interested in the fact that some language is nonsense. And about that same time, I realized that life itself is nonsense, because I remember looking through my telescope one night. I was about 7 or 8 at some distant object. And I remember thinking, well, you know, it was just, I'm sure you've all had this same question in your mind at some point in childhood, like, well, how big is this thing we're in, right? So when you ask that question, you sort of, your mind goes out to the wall, right? But then you say, just a minute here, doesn't there have to be something on the other side of a wall? But the only other option seems to be that it goes on forever and ever and ever. And that doesn't make sense either. It doesn't make sense to say that it comes to an end on a wall. And it doesn't make sense to say that it goes on and on forever. So I realized very early in life that we are enclosed in a sphere of nonsense. We just surrounded at all times by things that don't make sense. But that's okay, because nonsense, even though we have a negative drag on the word, kind of, in reality, we love nonsense. Dr. Seuss's books, hope you're all sitting down. Dr. Seuss's books have sold over 600 million copies. And probably most of you are too young to remember doo-wop music of the 50s with the nonsense as the main line or harmony, like sha-na-na-na-na, sha-na, and then the opposed to the meaningful line, get a job, and so on. And that whole style of music, or Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald with scat singing, and all the nursery rhymes, the playground rhymes that so many people have very fond childhood memories about. So nonsense is a very big, important part of life. And in terms of how you think about nonsense, as counterintuitive as this may seem, and I know it does, I'm not saying, I know this sounds not just counterintuitive, but frankly psychotic almost, you know, I mean, however, I guarantee you that if you think through this, you're going to see there's no way out of it. That if we learn how to think logically about things that don't make sense, then we have an entirely new way of investigating the question of life after death by genuinely rational means. You know, when people try to fool themselves, it doesn't work. You know, you always kind of deep down know you're fooling yourself, right? But many people, I think, are afraid to apply a really vigorous reasoning process to the afterlife question, because they'll think that it might come out in a negative way. But I say no, that if you apply the most rigorous reasoning to this whole process, then in the end, you come out with something that is very, very hopeful. So,
well, Dr. Moody, we have everybody on the sidebar buying the book. So we're going to have to invite you back when they have time to read it. And
wonderful. Thank you so much.
And you need to answer questions for us, which would be wonderful. And we have other questions in the sidebar as well. And the first one that we have is about negative near-death experiences. Sunday's asking that, and I was wondering if you could speak to that, and if you believe in them, and what exactly you think is happening there, maybe percentage-wise, how many you've heard of those?
Well, yes, I have a little bit of trouble speaking about hellish experiences because they are relatively rare. I know the George Gallup survey that was done in around 1979 or 80 addressed this. And in the survey they did, the percentage of negative ones were very, very small. I think it was either 3% or maybe it was even 0.3%. And so it's much harder to study a small number than it is to study a large number, right? And also, I have found that I've had a number over the years, but it seems to me that whereas the positive ones are more homogeneous, the negative ones seem to be all over the place and not any sort of common pattern to them. And a lot of them that were related to me really seemed to me to be delirium, because delirium is a state in which the images and the thinking is very surrealistically distorted, and that's what I see in some of these. So that's one thing. Then on the other side, my mind says, well, look, it could be that people who have a negative experience are just a lot more reluctant to talk about it, right? I mean, I can kind of imagine that if I'd had a hellish experience, I might be reluctant to say, oh, Doc, when I died, I went to hell. I might be more circumspect, right? But that part of it is, in terms of what people have told me from near-death experiences. Personally, to me, the notion of hell is a wonderful product of the vindictive imagination. And, the idea of God, creating a hell, I mean, it just seems pretty bizarre to me. It's like, and that image of justice we all have of the lady with the blindfold and the little two pans of the scale. Justice just means like a balance, right? Well, if you're going to tell me that because of, let's say somebody lives 80-something years, right? And that on the basis of those 80 years, and it's usually some ideological error, right? That, oh, you don't believe in the Trinity? Well, then you're going to hell. It's like, whatever. It's some ideological point that gets them stirred up. And so if you take that, on the one hand, the 80 years of, misconduct in your misbelieving in something, in the Bible, I guess. And then on the other hand, endless errors of trillions of eras, trillions of eons of billions of years, that's your torment forever. That takes it outside of the range of justice, and that puts it squarely in the framework of nonsense, if you ask me. I mean, I just think that there's an inherent incoherence in the whole nature of hell, or the whole notion of it. But
that's beautiful. That's a beautiful answer, and we truly appreciate it. And I think that answers a lot of questions. And
I gotta add to that too, though, something Mark Twain said. Mark Twain said, well, he said, heaven for the climate, but hell for the society.
That's wonderful. Well, listen, I have other questions here, if you don't mind answering them. One is about mirror gazing. Dana's asking if you could explain how to create a psychomantian, and if it only takes one mirror or several mirrors. And then there's another person, Tammy, is asking from Atlanta, if you're going to be doing any workshops about that coming up, if you have any of those workshops coming up. So maybe you could speak to what we need to do at home, and then maybe how we can see you in person.
I'm sorry, it's a little too complicated to explain in this brief time. But again, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to sell a book, but my new book, Making Sense of Nonsense, has that. That's included in there is the instructions on how to set it up. But it's not complicated at all, and just involves a mirror and a little light and a comfortable chair and a process you go through. but it's been replicated by many times by other people who read my original study and recreated it. So, you know, again, it seems very counterintuitive, but it does, it really does work. It's kind of amazing.
Well, that's perfect. And it's great to know that it's in this book that everybody is already acquiring right now. But are you doing any workshops on this anytime soon that you know of? I suppose it all depends on what happens with quarantine.
Yeah, really, we don't have any plans due to the COVID scare. But oh, now that you asked that, I will. I mean, listen, I'm not a commercial kind of guy, but my website is lifeafterlife.com. And I just really, I just wish so much I had personal contact with all of you folks tonight, because I'm having so much fun, and I hope you are too. This is, I'm doing a workshop on my website this weekend called God is Bigger Than the Bible. And you know, I didn't come to God from religion. I came to God from personal experience. So for the ideas of God that I've come up with just by talking with people with near-death experiences, essentially, and from my own personal encounters. And so what came out of this is this soon-to-be published book called God is Bigger Than the Bible. But that's, like I said, for now, it's on the
Whoops, you're a little frozen right now, but hopefully.
But unfortunately, I'm sorry.
Frozen?
It's frozen.
You're fine now. You're fine.
Oh,
It
good.
was just
Okay.
a few seconds. You're fine.
Yeah, I've always loved teaching, and yet, you know, anybody who's ever taught in a university knows about the politics. It's just so dreary. You know, you have the excitement of your teaching, and then the dreariness of all the faculty battles and so on. So I love this new way. I think I'm going to start doing this.
Again, just a little frozen.
House in 1993. The only, okay, what about now? Let's see. I'm so sorry about that.
You're fine now. You're fine. I'm sorry. I don't mean to keep interrupting you either.
Oh, no, this
Stay
is
quiet.
good, because I'm a little anxious about it. I want to know that people are hearing. There we go.
Well, it's been very rare, but I just like to be able to keep you from saying too much without us knowing what you're saying, because it's so interesting.
Yeah, good. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And we have lots of other questions too.
Oh,
but,
good. Good.
So let's keep going if you'd like. Lindsay is asking what your view on suicide is. I guess she's asking in terms of maybe the near-death experience, if there's been any other kinds of near-death experiences related to that possibly. Are you aware of anything like that?
Yes, I've talked with a lot of patients who had near-death experiences in connection with their suicide attempts. And also being a psychiatrist, a lot of dealing with people who were, you know, made suicide attempts and so on. And also as a clinician and as just as a person who thinks, I've come to realize that every adult human being that I know well enough to know them is committing suicide. I mean, I'm doing it by the cholesterol route. My wife is using the cell phone driving down the highway route. I have friends who are drinking themselves to death or smoking themselves to death. And I say, get real, get real. God, the Lord of the universe, is not going to be fooled by somebody who takes 30 years with cigarettes and, you know, as opposed to the person who takes 30 minutes by pills. You see what I'm saying? So, so where I stand on this is that everybody that I know who had a near-death experience in connection with a suicide attempt tells me the identical same thing, namely, they would never try it again. Not because they felt that they would end up in some terrible hell, but just because, and one sense you get of a lot of these people is they say it's kind of like walking out of the movie in the middle of the movie, but that you realize that you're going to have to see the sadness that your action brought about in the lives of your loved ones who were left behind. But that also it's just like you can't get out of this thing we're in by it's kind of like a sentence in a way. And you know, that's a very effective metaphor for me. And you know, you got to go through it. It's so suicide doesn't work. If the people who tell me that it's like they figured that if it had worked, they would be on a sidetrack and kind of just having to sort of be held back till all the action got started past where they had blocked it off or something. So I don't know. They say it's very hard to explain, but just don't do it. is their action. I remember George Ritchie telling me, I had known him for 6 years before I was a psychiatry resident there. And I remember George used to tell me, he said, you know, when you start talking with these suicidal patients, he said, you're going to have to be, you know, sitting there biting your cheeks to try to keep from leaping in to tell them all this stuff. Because, you know, it's not therapeutic to tell your patient about near-death experiences, right? But George was right. I mean, it's just such a, and I have been there, by the way. I have certified tried. But so I just, all of this comes to the statement, don't do it, don't do it.
Well, thank you. And I have some other very interesting questions. Paula is asking, what's your point of view regarding the differences observed during near-death experiences versus out-of-body experiences? It seems that most near-death experiences describe having spiritual experiences, and out-of-body experiences more often describe Summerland-like experiences. Is that what you've seen?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And in addition to the close call with death, which we all know about, there are other circumstances which fairly regularly bring about out-of-body experiences too. And one of them is the experience of looking through. There was a article some years ago in an astronomical journal. A friend of mine who is an astronomer gave it to me, and it was case reports of astronomers who found that while they were gazing through their telescopes, they would suddenly find themselves up above their bodies, looking at themselves, looking through their telescopes. And another situation, which I found out from my friend Eric Pagani, who is a concert pianist in Paris and also a editor of Psychology, which is their famous psychology magazine over there. And Eric described to me in 1988 an experience he had when he was doing a concert, and he left his body for 17 minutes. He played 3 pieces during the time. But from his point of view, he was up above his body in a light. And so then he got to thinking, well, if this has happened to me, it's happened to other people. So he wrote a wonderful book on from his operatic friends who described these spiritual experiences they had had on stage. So yes, and I don't really quite know what the connection is between those out-of-body experiences we have in other contexts and the ones we have in near-death experiences. But it's a very interesting question.
That's fascinating. Kind of like a shared death experience then as well. And Mark Ireland, who's actually the co-founder of Helping Parents Heal, he's asking if you stay up with the near-death research, experience research of doctors Parnias, Sartori, von Lommel, Long, and others whose conclusions support your own?
Oh, yes. And, you know, these people are friends of mine. I've known, you know, Pim van Lommel, I guess, since 1988, I think it was, and Jeffrey Long. And, you know, these guys are my friends. Yeah, absolutely. Although I will say that my research is on a different kind of angle, really. It's so I mean, I think it's all very complementary. I do.
I have a lot of people talking about Dr. Seuss, and as it's their favorite author for their children. And Anna is asking, are you familiar with induced after-death communication as a component of EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing therapy? Your thoughts? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do. I read the book and I know a little bit about it. I've never practiced it, but my general thought is that there are probably various methods for getting across that disconnect, or whatever it is between this world and that next one. And I've heard people talk about their success with that method. It's you know, it's very interesting, but I don't know much about it.
That's wonderful. And so we have other people asking other questions as well. Let's see. Denise is saying, you have used the word nonsense often. I think it may mean something different to me than in the context that you're using it in. Do you have a definition of what nonsense is?
Yes, if you look in the dictionary, what nonsense is number one, it's language, right? It's not extra linguistic behavior. Like sometimes we may say to kids who are bouncing on the sofa, stop your nonsense, referring to their extra linguistic activities, but that's not the dictionary definition. That's an extended one. And nonsense is language that is unintelligible, that it doesn't convey any clear thought to the mind. Like, 'twas really in the slithy toves that Gyron gimble in the wave, or like, holiness pursues the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity, or like, that cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. Right? And there are all kinds of different patterns of unintelligibility. But Chinese is unintelligible to Raymond Moody. That doesn't mean that Chinese is nonsense. That means that Raymond Moody has a certain kind of limit, right? So nonsense is language that is unintelligible because it is meaningless. And the great literary examples of it would be Dr. Seuss, Lewis Carroll, and Shel Silverstein, and Beckett, Samuel Beckett, and Waiting for Godot, and so on. it's a range of language. Now, there's another use of it in ordinary language where it's used to criticize something, but that's not what I'm talking about here. When we say, stop your nonsense or whatever, that's a different meaning from what I'm getting at here. This is more like the kind of language that Dr. Seuss is famous for. And, you know, for those of you who might have read Dr. Seuss when you were young or have read it when your kids were young, you might go back to it at this phase of life and see. There's a lot of wisdom in that. My favorite line from him is in his book, On Beyond Zebra, which that I never could spell if I stopped with the Z. I'm telling you this because you're one of my friends. My alphabet starts where your alphabet ends. And it's full of very mind-bending things, his books.
That's beautiful. So Denise is explaining, she's the one who asked that question, that it was a beautiful answer, and I agree. And that poem that you were reading by Lewis Carroll is one of my dad's favorites. He used to say it to us all the time. It's just such a fun thing to say as well. And also, I was wondering, there are two different questions that kind of are similar. One is your thoughts on past lives, and one is your thoughts on reincarnation, which obviously kind of are similar.
Yeah, well, the way I've come around to that is academically respectable way, I guess. My dear friend was Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, and he is kind of on reincarnation, but and I am not criticizing Ian behind his back. I mean, he's passed away anyway, but and Ian and I used to have conversations about this. Ian just didn't have a very critical mind. You could sort of convince Ian of anything that he already believed as long as you got the footnotes right. And so he and I used to have this good-natured conversation. I have a different set of standards, but where I have finally come over to it is kids, both adopted at birth, now 19 and 21. And I should also tell you, my wife and I, we don't take these kids to church things. We don't talk about life after death. We talk about what's for dinner, the homework, what's on at the movies this weekend. And my kids, these two kids, found out about my book, Life After Life, by looking me up on the internet. But both of them, when they were little, specifically said things that I just don't know what else to say except they were accurate, and they both told us where they were before they came in to us, and both accounts made sense with things we knew about already. So, I mean, again, this is entirely personal. It's not that I would try to convince anybody else of this. But even David Hume said, of all the different theories of the afterlife, he said the only one that a genuinely rational and philosophical person could entertain, he said, was the idea of reincarnation.
Well, that's wonderful, and thank you for that explanation. And what an amazing thing for your sons. And I have a few more questions, but I don't want to take too much of your time. Are you willing to maybe take two more questions? Is that possible, Dr. Moody?
Oh, absolutely. I'm just really enjoying this, and I wish I could see you all, and I sort of be really nice to be able to be personally with you guys, but thank you so much for doing it this way anyway. So.
Well, we would have loved to have had you with us personally as well, but this is definitely the second best thing. And Jean is asking, can Dr. Moody explain his recent discovery where he found using nonsense helped to enter a higher level of consciousness or an alternate reality? I guess that this might be in your book then, is that right? She can't really exactly.
It is.
Okay.
Well, I could sort of sketch that out. Yeah, because this is throughout history, nonsense has been used as a method to alter consciousness, and this seems unfamiliar until you sort of try to check it out against known spiritual traditions. And one would be, for example, the Christian practice of glossolalia, or speaking in unknown tongues. And linguists have studied this. What it is, it consists of nonsense syllables drawn from the speaker's own language, put together in such a way that avoids meaningful combinations and avoids grammatical structures. And so there's various kinds of ideas about the spiritual significance of glossolalia and the Christian tradition. But I can tell you personally, not being anything religious, I can tell you from personal experience of doing it, that you don't need to have an ecstatic state to get it started. But if you just let yourself go and start doing it, you do, after persistence, reach a very profound ecstatic state. And if you think about it, the purpose of Zen koans is very similar. The Zen koan is a nonsensical question, right? Like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? But the Zen master would put the student on that question, and the student would first try to solve it by logic. But the idea was eventually this process would spark the student over into another state of consciousness. And another good example would be shaman songs. Shaman songs were combinations of nonsense syllables and meaningless refrains put together with elements of meaningful language, such that the combination was more powerful than either alone and would actually put people over into, from their point of view, the spirit world or the other side. Now, conversely to this, on the other side of it, there are also recipes, magical procedures going back to ancient Greece, which describe how magical nonsense words were used to call forth the deceased at these oracles of the dead and so on. So there's a lot of historical connection there, and you absolutely can alter your mind by various kinds of techniques of nonsense. I've discovered quite a number of them just because I've been interested in this subject for so long. And one I've discovered, and you can check this out for yourself, you have to do it with pizzazz. You can rehearse some nonsense thing. It's like holiness pursues the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. And then when you get really good at it, you just spring it on somebody, you just say it. And very often what you find is that triggers an unconscious process in them where they will talk nonsense back to you, but they're not aware of doing it. I mean, it's just really the most uncanny thing. And there's some really nice folks from the intelligence community, as you might imagine, have been very interested in this work. And one of the officers said, after he went to this workshop, he said, very shortly thereafter got back in touch with me, and he said, my colleagues and I found that we were very easily able to reproduce your findings just by walking into the local Starbucks. So it's nonsense is a very powerful modality of the mind that has been ignored and forgotten. And, in this book, I'm not trying to sell, but again, it's I got all the exercises that I used with my students over the many years I taught this. And the students, agreed that it opened up parts of their mentation or their mental field they just didn't know they had. And then at the end, when you bring all this together to the question of life after death, we realize there's entirely new ways to go about working on this big question.
Jean is saying, thank you very much for elaborating. That was a wonderful answer. And I know that you were, early on, you were an astronomy, I think, major student. Carol is asking about the link between astronomy and the afterlife. Is there anything that kind of drew you in because of that?
Well, it's a very interesting historical phenomenon that even though in the year 2020, we see the question of, say, extraterrestrial life and the question of life after death as two separate questions, you really don't have to go very far back in history until they merge. And back in the early 19th century, Chalmers, I forgot his first name, but his last name was Chalmers, Chalmers. He was a famous, I think, Oxford theologian or professor of theology.
You froze,
Stars,
Dr.
and Kant had sort of accurately conjectured that the blobs, that the resolution of their limit of their current telescopes were other galaxies. So this created a problem for the theologians because they say, well, since the Bible says that humans are the be-all and end-all, what are all these other planets for? And that caused Chalmers to write these books on how the distant planets are the abode of our departed loved ones. And that sounds so ridiculous to us in 2020, but at the 200 years ago, this was what the average educated person in Britain and America actually was believing at that time.
That's beautiful. And yeah, obviously, why not? That's a wonderful thing to think. And Jean is saying Thomas Chalmers in the chat box. Maybe one more question if possible, and I think this kind of sums everything up as well. I love this question from Jackie. She's asking, on a personal level, how do you stay balanced in your own life? Do you meditate, or what is it that you do to take care of yourself?
Well, I have been, for as long as I can remember, I've been a walker. And I hop on my treadmill every morning and go. Until a few years ago, I walked 6 miles a day. After an injury a few years ago, the doctor told me to come back slowly, and I got up to 3 miles a day. And I felt better than I'd been doing, because I'd been walking 6 miles a day for 20 years. And then when I cut back, I realized I was feeling better doing 3 miles a day. So that's about what I do. And I mean, and also the fact is I don't have myself together, right? And I'm just as crazy as all of us are. one of the things I learned in psychiatry, which everybody agrees with, is I've learned what normal is, and that's normal is somebody you don't know very well, right? Think about it. And so I'm still just as messed up as I ever was, but the walking does help.
So that means that you don't do meditation, which we're all aspiring to do, but it doesn't take meditation to be able to do the amazing things that you've done, all of the research that you've done, and learn the amazing things then.
Well, I don't know if what I do is meditating or not, but I just go into that hypnagogic state, like when you're halfway between the wakeful state and the sleep state. I've always loved doing that. I just go down, and that's, to me, very associated with creativity. I get a lot of my good ideas at that time.
Well, and you did do mirror gazing before, and maybe still a little bit, which is definitely a form of meditation. So, and active meditation, people are saying in the sidebar as well. And people are...
You know something, Elizabeth, that just triggered something in my mind. I've never thought of this before, but just the way you said it. One activity I did, which in my life, which brought a certain amount of meditative stability to me, was I worked in a maximum security unit for the criminally insane with psychotic men who had mostly done these terrible murders you read about in the National Enquirer, and the chopping up people and all those things. But it's that was a fascinating experience to work with the criminally insane, and I probably talked in my career to, maybe as a conservative estimate, because I did a lot of it in medical school too, was for maybe 300 murderers. And that will give you a certain perspective on life too, that it's like you realize that most of the things you face in life every day are not of that level of gravity, right? And so it provides a sort of counterbalance to I found that these things started coming out years later. That when you're in a situation where, you're a constant danger of being assaulted, because these people are psychotic and assaultive and murderous. That's why they're there. And so having that kind of awareness throughout the day for an extended period of time, you can't give yourself the luxury to think about it, right? So what I have found is that it went underground for many years, but just several years ago, it began to reemerge. And even though it took 30 years, but eventually it did sort of come back up. And, to think about homicide and what an extreme act that is. And it's a great human mystery in a way. So, and I think that kind of experience there with all that danger really did give me a certain perspective on life, where things that may seem bad to others maybe don't seem so much bad to me sometimes. Yeah.
Well, and you certainly have lived an incredible life to have been working with 300 different people who were obviously very dangerous for such an extended period of time. We have people writing in the sidebar, Dr. Moody, you are so humble and so very nice. Everyone here has been telling about how kind you are and how interesting you are to listen to. And again, people are all ordering the book, so we're hoping that we'll be able to set up another time for you to come back and to speak to
Wonderful.
the
I would
group.
just love to hear your comments. I
Well,
would. To go
yes.
back to that, honest to goodness, I think that I've made a breakthrough here. And by subjecting it to the process of like everybody looking into it and trying to refute it, like, I think that this is something that's going to stick, is what I think.
That's very, very exciting. And we are so appreciative of you and your whole family for allowing us into your home tonight and for speaking to us for such a long time. And so I will be back in touch with you if this is okay to set up another time for us to speak. And we really
Great.
appreciate it so much. And I want to tell you from all of us, because everyone's writing this in the sidebar, how appreciative we are of you being here tonight. And I'm going to ask everyone to unmute, although I think that Irene and I have to, here we go, unmute everyone to say goodbye and thank you to Dr. Moody.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye.
Moody.
Thank
It
you.
was
Thank you, Dr.
wonderful.
Moody. Such
Thank
a
you so
pleasure.
much.
Your work, my whole life, I've been reading you.
Thank you, Dr. Moody.
Thank you very
Good
much.
to see you, Raymond. Good to see you, Raymond. Be well.
Good seeing you guys. Thank you.
Ah.
Oh, it's
Thank you so much.
we all
We
say
appreciate it.
Reading your
Been
books for
reading you
years.
For 40 years.
Thank you.
Dr. Moody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Moody.
you.
Loved all your messages.
Thank you all for being on here. And thank you, Dr. Moody.
Thanks.